Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this week's video we're talking vintage shopping in Sydney, where to go and how to shop for it. Everyone's had a lovely week so far. If you're new here, my name is Alarna and I'm a fashion stylist and image consultant based here in Sydney, Australia. Now, I've been doing a lot of vintage shopping over my career as a fashion stylist, and I do love the hunt. I love going into vintage stores and finding pieces that have a lot of personality to them, that have a story behind them, that is something that is unique that we might not find in a store today, or is something that a lot of stores are referencing and reusing as a trend piece. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the differences between thrifting and going to a vintage store. We're also going to talk about some of my top picks for vintage stores around Sydney and why I like them. And then I'm going to share with you some shopping tips for vintage. So if you're a complete newbie and you really want to start out doing some vintage shopping, or if you are a seasoned vintage shopper and you just want to pick up some extra tips, then this video is for you. I hope you guys enjoy it and let's get into it. So first, let's talk about thrifting versus vintage and what that means in Sydney, because when you're doing thrifting and you're doing vintage shopping in Sydney, it does come with Sydney prices. So let's talk about what the difference is. Now, when it comes to shopping between thrift stores and vintage stores, I think it's important to remember if you're looking for vintage pieces in thrift stores, you're not always going to expect charity prices, because not all thrift stores are charity stores. So they're not all St. Vincent de Paul's or Vinnie's or Smith's Family or anything like that. There are actually specialist thrift stores out there that have been curated by someone, and because they've been curated, sometimes these pieces come at a higher price. Keep in mind, these stores do often get delivery on a certain date, and it's a good idea if you are really into looking for your vintage pieces to actually ask them when they're getting their next round of stock in. That way you can go in there and have fresh pickings of what's there. Otherwise, when you get in, you might find all the good stuff has been taken. I actually find thrift stores to be better for those who do like the hunt, or those who actually just want to find something that might be excess stock from a brand, or something that's relatively recent that someone no longer wanted. Now, when it comes to vintage stores, a lot of the hard work has been done for you, because someone who is passionate, someone that is very knowledgeable, has spent the time to curate the pieces that they're going to have in their store for you. So that does mean that those pieces are going to be a little bit more expensive, and they might be quite a bit more expensive depending on the brand and the rarity of that type of garment. What I like about vintage stores is that a lot of them specialize in an era, a brand, a style, or even a type of garment, and that makes shopping in vintage stores a lot easier. It makes it much more exciting, and it makes the success rate and the chances that you're going to walk out of there with something fantastic even higher. Alright, now let's talk about my top stores, the ones that I have really enjoyed and I've had great experiences in Sydney. I've gone to these ones over the years and I found them all to be fantastic and very helpful in these stores. And one thing I find that all of these have in common is that they are well organized and they have a really good customer experience. So let's get into it. So the first one is one I've mentioned previously. I think I mentioned it in my Sydney hotspots shopping video, and if you haven't seen that video, I think it was like my second YouTube video. I'm going to link that above, whatever side that's going to be on. I'm going to link that for you guys. And this particular store is amazing. I remember this is probably one of the first vintage stores in Sydney I actually started to go into quite a bit. Every single time I've been in there, I've had a good experience. The staff members in there are lovely. They're passionate and they certainly know their stuff, but I think the whole store layout is amazing. There's a shoe wall, there's amazing hats. They even have a really great Instagram that you can actually go on and see, and they do actually sell things on their Instagram as well. So even if you aren't in Sydney and you're thinking you'd like to have a look at some of the pieces that they have sourced and curated, go and check their Instagram out. Now, the next one that I've got is another favorite of mine. It's a little bit more niche, but I think it's a fantastic store, and that is Route 66. Route 66 is in Newtown on Enmore Road. I think they only just moved stores recently. Their store is really well organized. I was surprised when I went in there to this new store as to how easy it was to shop in. It was fantastic. They have racks full of just flares for women. They have racks full of kind of cowboy style shirts. They've got boots on one wall. It's amazing. They've got a decent fitting room area. When you go into this store, it is very much geared towards the Western cowboy country kind of aesthetic. They have men's and women's clothing in there, and it's a great place to go and shop for denim jeans if you're on the hunt for some good vintage jeans. Next is Dolly Up Vintage, and these guys are in Cleveland Street, I'm pretty sure in Surry Hills. Dolly Up Vintage is fantastic for dresses. So if you are a dress person and you really want to get your hands on some beautiful vintage pieces, the girls in here really do a great job at finding cool dresses. I've never walked in there and felt disappointed at the dress options that are in there. In fact, if I had a client that said to me, I want to go and buy a vintage dress, this would be the store I would probably take them to first. The girls in there are absolutely lovely. They sell French vintage and they also sell rare designer pieces too. Then we've got Potts Point Vintage, and they're another one that I mentioned in that same video about my favorite places to shop in Sydney, but Potts Point Vintage is so good on jackets. They always have amazing jackets. And it's funny, once you start getting into vintage shopping, you'll get to know which types of stores do what really well, and Potts Point Vintage are amazing with jackets. They really know how to pick up a good 70s and 80s jacket. Really cool menswear in there. They love a big collar. I get really excited when I get to go in there with a client of mine and go and pick out some cool jackets from them. Next, we've got Bowerbird Vintage, and they're over in Newtown, and there are plenty of really good vintage stores in Newtown, by the way. Actually, a lot of these are in Newtown and Surry Hills, but this particular one is super colorful. They got men's and women's clothing. They generally kind of range between the 1960s, 70s, 80s. I've seen a bit of 90s stuff in there. I quite like them just because they have variety and they have color, and whoever is doing their curation really has a good eye for print. There's always a lot of really fun prints in that store. And then we've got C's Flashback, and C's Flashback has been around for a while. It's over in Surry Hills. One thing I find them to be really good at having is 90s and 80s streetwear. So they're fantastic for things like hats, really cool t-shirts, cool hoodies, cool jeans, sometimes really good sneakers as well. I think they're a really good store if you are going for that type of look, especially with that 90s street style kind of vibe. Then I wanted to mention as well another one that isn't actually a store you can go in and buy vintage dresses from. It's actually a vintage dress hire place. It's called Bell Street. It's in Marrickville. They also do custom bridal. They have a great website which looks like it's getting updated at the moment, which is really exciting, so you can actually go on there and see what they have. Go and check them out on Instagram. They're also very inclusive with their size range, which is something that I really appreciate, and they have a lot of different styles of vintage dresses too. The lovely lady who's in there curating those things has an amazing eye. She's got beautiful colors, all sorts of necklines and silhouettes, and a lot of different kind of eras going on in her store. Now, the other one that I wanted to mention is one that often frequents a lot of Sydney markets. They're called Pretty Frocked Vintage. They do have an Etsy store if you aren't based in Sydney, but you can often find them at like Surry Hills markets. I think I've seen them there a few times. They do a lot of kind of 70s, late 70s and 80s pieces. I find really cool dresses, really beautiful things with like crocheted details on them, cool sleeves, fun prints. That real kind of 70s kind of color palette is going on with a lot of the pieces that they've picked. They have a really good eye for picking things from the 70s and 80s. So they're a cool one to check out if you're ever at a market in Sydney. Now I wanted to talk you through some shopping tips for vintage shopping, because I know it can be really overwhelming. I know for me, like, I've always loved the hunt for shopping, and I really do get excited about the idea of coming across something that I know is decent vintage. Like if I ever came across something that was like an old, cool Australian brand, a brand I knew was made in Melbourne, or even a cool overseas sourced brand, I would get super duper excited. But I know that not everyone is as excited about it as I am, and I know as well that sometimes it's a feeling of where do you start. So I'm going to talk through some of my shopping tips, and this is for people who are absolutely starting from maybe never shopping for vintage before, or people that might want to start getting into it. So my first tip is to actually think about what you want. And I know this sounds a little bit weird, but I think if you go into a store without really knowing what you're after, even if it wasn't a vintage store, it's more likely you'll walk away with something that you're not actually going to use. So before you go into a vintage store, think to yourself, are you going in there because you want to find a cool jacket? Do you want to find a dress? Do you want to find a pair of jeans? Do you want to find a coat? Maybe even think about things like, are you looking for something in a particular color? Is there a print you really love? Perhaps there is a style of garment you really want to start incorporating into your wardrobe. So think about what you want first, and more often than not, vintage stores actually have racks dedicated to a type of garment. You might find that, like Zoo Emporium for example, they have a whole rack full of sequin garments. They have a whole section full of peasant blouses. You can go into stores that might just have like Route 66, a whole rack of flares. So if you know roughly what you're after, you can go straight in and kind of hone in on what you're looking at. So tip number 2 is to ask for it. The people that work in these stores are often the ones that have done a lot of the curating themselves. They're the ones that organize the racks. They're the ones that put things back after people have tried them on. They certainly have a lot of knowledge about the types of garments that are in there, and they often have a lot of really good fashion history knowledge as well. So if you went in there and you were asking for a dress coat that looked a little bit new look and it had maybe a 50s kind of style to it, or it was a particular color, you could show them a picture and say, do you have anything like this, or have you seen anything like this? They might even be able to say to you, I'll make a note of that and I'll give you a call if something like this comes in. Some vintage stores even go out finding things for people as well. So it's a really good thing to do, is just go up and simply ask at the counter if they have the item you are after. Now, the other thing I find really helpful is actually showing them the type of style you're going for. I remember I went into Zoo Emporium about, I think it was a month ago. I went shopping with a client of mine. It was so hot. The guy let me stand behind the counter near the fan and cool down. And I went in there and I said, listen, I'm sourcing stuff for a photo shoot. It needs to be a bit Jimi Hendrix, David Bowie mixed with a little bit kind of 70s boho, but I do not want it to be Woodstock. And he knew straight away what I was after. And he whipped around that store and really cut down on the stuff that we needed to look at and helped us get in and out quickly. And I really appreciated that. So thank you, Zoo Emporium, for doing that for me. So if you guys go in there with a mood board, you go in there with reference images, or if you can articulate what it is you're after, do that. It's really going to help you find what you need. Now, the next thing is to know the decade or the era you are wanting to shop for. So plenty of people have a particular idea in their head of what the vintage look is that they're after, or the type of thing that they feel excited about. So an example of this, something that is really common at the moment, and you might find you're actually wanting to do vintage shopping because you're seeing these things coming out in fashion. Something that's really popular at the moment is a thing called Regency core. It's starting to come out. Bridgerton has been a huge influence on it. It's clothing that looks a little bit like it's from the Regency period, or it might have little kind of hints to the Regency period in it. You can go into a vintage store and see if they have anything that might have a bit of a nod back to that. You might also find you like 90s street style, or you might find that you really enjoy the 70s and maybe you like a 70s kind of Woodstock vibe, or you like a 70s suit or a Charlie's Angels or a Bowie vibe. There are so many different things you could go for when it comes to the decade. So try and get an understanding of what decade you want your piece to be from. Now, tip number 4 is to take a tape measure with you. I think it's important to realize that sizing has not really been standard over the years. A size 14 in the 50s was very different to what a size 14 is today. So when you go in there, remember that even though they might have items organized by size, it might not mean that it's actually your size today. So if you know your measurements, or you can take a tape measure with you, it's going to help you so you don't actually get in the fitting room and you get one leg into your garment and realize the other leg is just not going to fit in there. Now, tip number 5 is to feel the fabric and check the lining of the garment. Over the years, the fashion quality has declined from about the 80s, 90s, 2000s. What we actually bring out in stores is quite different to what used to be out in stores regularly. We had a little bit kind of, I guess, more refined fabrics back then. I think it's important just to make sure that you like the feel of the garment. You don't think the fabric's going to be too hot or scratchy or uncomfortable for you to wear. And also, you need to consider whether or not you're going to be able to look after this particular type of garment. Next, you want to check for damage. So you might want to check for things like rips, moth holes, pit stains. You might even find things like checking the seams, and even if the zips work, could be something that you want to look at. Make sure that if it does have some kind of damage to it, that it's something that you can repair, or it's something that you're happy to live with. Usually once you walk out of a vintage store with an item that is damaged, you often can't get your money back, or you might be able to exchange the item, but usually what you see is what you get. And if you go home with something that has a bit of damage on it and you can't fix it, it can be a little bit heartbreaking to learn that after you've purchased it. And tip number 7 is to actually check and see the cost or the need for tailoring. I think a lot of the time when we go into a vintage store, we get more excited about something actually just fitting than we do the general piece. So think about whether or not you actually like the garment as a whole and if you will wear it. But also think that if you are going to tailor something, say if you're purchasing a garment that is way too big for you, think to yourself, how much is this going to cost me to get this tailored or to fix a particular thing on the garment? I see a lot of the time, I frequent my tailor almost every single day. day with my clients. So I see a lot of the time people coming in with vintage pieces that they thought would be a super easy alteration that is a really big remodel, and that can really blow the budget and can suck the life out of going vintage shopping. So have a bit of a think about what you need, and if you need a little bit of help in that area, you can always hire me. I'm here in Sydney, or take someone with you that is really savvy when it comes to understanding sewing, and it might help you to cut down on buying things that aren't quite right. Now, tip number 8 is make sure you are buying something that goes with what you have at home. So make sure maybe you bring something with you that you're trying to pair with an item. Have a good think about how you're actually going to wear this garment. I think a lot of the time we go into vintage stores and we kind of get swept up in the whole thing, and even though it's really lovely in the moment, you might come home and feel like you actually have nothing that goes with this garment because nothing else is reminiscent of the period in which you purchased the garment, or the colors or the shapes. It's a very different silhouette to what you're used to. I actually find when I go into vintage stores, I like wearing separates because it helps me try on different garments and get a really good idea of whether or not I'll actually wear that item outside in the real world, outside of the beautiful vintage store. Now, I've gone and put together a blog post about vintage shopping, and I've got a little bit of a vintage directory that I've put together for you guys over on my website. I'm going to leave a link to that in the description below for you guys. And if you want to start working on your style, whether it involves vintage clothes or not, I've actually got a really good course that can help whip your wardrobe into shape and build an amazing capsule wardrobe for you. So I've linked that in the description below for you guys too. You can check that out. Now, I hope you guys have a lovely week. Please like, please subscribe if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more and be notified when I bring out a video. And I'll see you guys on Sunday with another video.